Playing through chord tones isn't very simple at the intermediate stage of guitar. But what if there was a way in which we can glide around the fretboard inside of the scale shapes we're already familiar with and effortlessly create phrases with strong melodic directions? The good news is we can learn how to do just that by learning how to make the most out of our arpeggios. So today we're going to cover every arpeggio shape you need for your diatonic 7th chords, how to connect these arpeggio shapes to chords and scales you already know, and how to actually phrase with these arpeggios to sound musical. If you don't know who I am, I help intermediates become more advanced players. Now, if you're looking to take your playing to the next level, I recommend you join the free school community in the description. For those of you who are interested in progressing as fast as humanly possible, we do offer a guitar transformation service. Again, that's for those who are interested in taking their playing to the next level. So before we start using arpeggios, we should know what they are, where they come from, and how we're going to use them when we actually play the instrument. So an arpeggio is what we get when we play all of the notes of a chord individually in sequence, rather than playing every note together. So if I have just a basic triad, I can play all the notes together like that, or I can play them in sequence from lowest note to the highest note, and I get an arpeggio. So we're just taking the individual parts that make up a chord and playing them in sequence. So the most basic way we can do this is to take just a regular triad. So we play a root, then a third, and then a fifth, and we just play the notes in sequence like that. Conceptually, you can start building upon this foundation. You can imagine if you had like a major triad with a ninth in there as well, you could start playing arpeggios with the ninth, and you can add that extra note in around the fretboard too. So arpeggios are useful for turning your chords into melodic lines because of this, right? Because we're not actually playing all the notes together, we're playing them individually. It leads more naturally to melodies rather than like chords and harmony, right? Now, within our diatonic scale, we have 7 different triads and so on inside your key signature. And again, seeing as we can play each triad, we can also arpeggiate each triad. Right? So we need to know which chords are going to be major and minor, and then how to turn them into 7th chords, and then we're going to figure out how to turn those chords into arpeggios and play interesting melodic lines from there. In our diatonic key signature, we have the 1 chord, which is going to be major. We have the 2 chord, which is going to be minor. We have our 3 chord, which is going to be minor. Our 4 chord, which is going to be major. Our 5 chord, which is going to be major. 6 chord, which is going to be minor. And then finally, the last one, the 7 chord, is diminished. And that's the only diminished chord in the diatonic key. So we can level up those triads that I just talked about by adding up an extra note on top of them to make them 7th chords. So instead of just having a regular major triad, we can add a major 7th and get an interesting sound like that. Or we could do the same for a minor chord, where we add a minor 7th and we get more kind of interesting, fancy kind of sounds. So to follow along with our lesson today, we're going to need to know which chords in your key signature get turned into what type of 7th chord, right? So your 1 and 4 chord are going to be turned into major 7th chords. Just regular major 7th. So in the key of G major, the 1 chord is G. And then the 4 chord is C. We can turn these into major 7th chords. The minor chords are 2, 3, and 6 chord. We can turn them into minor 7th chords. See, our odd ones out that we haven't talked about so far are the 5 chord and the 7th chord. We're not really going to go too much into the 7th chord today. It's a diminished chord, and we're not really going to focus too much on diminished triads. But our 5 chord is interesting. The 5 chord gets turned into a dominant chord. This is a major triad with a minor 7th on the top. So it's a major chord, but it has a minor seventh. Our 1 and a 4 chord are major triads with a major seventh that sound like this. However, our 5 chord, which is another major triad, is a major triad with a minor seventh. So it sounds a bit different, a bit more tense. And this means we're going to have to learn different arpeggio shapes for each types. So today we're going to cover the major 7 arpeggio shapes, the dominant 7 arpeggio shapes, and the minor 7 arpeggio shapes. And learning how to play these across the fretboard is going to give you plenty of places to create strong melodic lines when you're improvising. So essentially we only really have 3 different arpeggio types that we're going to learn today, and we're going to learn 2 different spots to play each type on the fretboard. So again, we got the major 7 arpeggio, the dominant 7 arpeggio, and the minor 7 arpeggio. So let's figure out how we're supposed to play them on the neck. So we're going to play one shape starting from the low E string, and then another shape starting from the A string. So that gives us 2 spots on the fretboard to play these shapes. So we have a major 7 chord. Let's play G major 7, right, which is the 1 chord in the key of G. So we want to play the G major 7 arpeggio all the way across the strings like this. So that right there, when you're playing a G major or just a G major 7 chord, you're playing all the notes for that chord individually. So whenever you play that arpeggio shape over that chord, you're going to get some really nice, interesting, strong melodic sounds. So we can play that over here like that over the top of this chord from the root of the low E string. Now we can do the exact same thing from the root of the A string as well. Now what's cool about this is that our 1 chord and 4 chord in our diatonic key are actually right next to each other from the E to the A string. So if we learn to play the A string root, we've got like the 1 and 4 arpeggio shapes right next to each other. So yeah, the A string root major 7 shape goes over this chord like this, and the 4 chord in the key of G is C major 7. And we play the major 7 arpeggio shape from the root of the A string like this. So right there you've got 2 spots to play 2 different chords right on top of each other. And you could also imagine, like, if you needed to play G major 7 across the neck as well up here, you have a G major 7 from the A string root over here, and you can do the exact same thing over there where you played this arpeggio shape, or again if you wanted to play C major 7 from the root over here. So those are our major 7 shapes that we've got out the way. So now let's look at the minor 7 shape, and we're going to start on the low E string. Now we know that we can play a minor 7 for our 2 chord, our 3 chord, and our 6 chord. So let's start with the low E string shape for A minor 7. That's the 2 chord in the key of G major. So we start from the root note of A on the E string, and the minor 7 shape from here looks like this. So whenever you're playing like over an A minor type of sound, you have those arpeggio shapes that you can play over the top of that, and you're going to get some strong, interesting, melodic sounds when you just play those arpeggio notes. So that's our shape from the low E string over there. And we also have this shape that we can do from the A string. Now again, we know that the 2, 3, and 6 chord we can use a minor 7 arpeggio over the top of. So we also have a 6 chord in the key of G major, which is going to be E minor. So we might as well just play the minor 7 shape from the A string for E minor. So yeah, this arpeggio shape is going to work over the top of this type of chord over here, this chord shape over here. So we play from here. And the arpeggio shape for the A string looks like this. So right there, if we were going between like the 2 and the 6 chord in a chord progression, you could improvise something that's like... You've got 2 arpeggio shapes for chords that are right next to each other for different chords. And it's going to sound like you're highlighting the chord changes when you go between different chords with different arpeggio shapes. So now that we've got the major 7 out the way and the minor 7 out the way, finally we have the last one we're going to tackle today, and that's the dominant 7 type of sound. So to play the dominant 7, let's look at the 5 chord in the key of G major. This is going to be D major, or D7, D dominant 7. And we can play the low E string shape from here for D7 like this. So whenever we're playing over a D7 chord in this position over here from the low E string, we have that kind of shape that we can play over the top of. And again, we can do the exact same thing from the A string as well. So if we find where the note D is on the A string, we have this shape that we can play from the A string root. And that's going to work over that dominant type of sound over there. So now that we actually know how to play these shapes, how are we actually really supposed to use them to sound musical? It's one thing knowing them, and you probably already know kind of parts of these shapes before. You probably experimented and found out accidentally that you might be playing over an arpeggio. But yeah, it's one thing actually knowing the shape, but it's another thing actually knowing how to use it. So what are we supposed to do to make these shapes sound musical? The first thing we need to do is we need to visualize how these arpeggio shapes fit in around scales and chords that we're already familiar with. So let's look at some chords first, right? You can use these arpeggios to add in some fills around your chord playing. So if I had a chord progression that was just going from the 4 major 7 to the 1 major 7, I could add something interesting over the top by adding some fills around those chords. Maybe something like this. And again, you can do this for like any type of chord. You don't have to do it for major 7 chords. Let's say I had like doing this minor 7 chord over here, like. Again, it's completely up to you how you use these arpeggio shapes and what chords you use them over. You don't have to copy what I'm doing note for note in the video. It's the kind of the idea of how you approach using these shapes is the important part. And that's just a way you can use them. There's little kind of... There's like little fills in between the chords you're playing to blend in that rhythm and lead sound together. You can also kind of see that when you play an arpeggio shape for one chord that's diatonic in your chord progression, it usually leads quite nicely, voice leads quite nicely into the next chord in your chord progression. They glue everything together. It makes your melody sound more connected when you can blend between arpeggios for different chords inside your key signature. And you might have also noticed how I phrased each arpeggio shape as well. I didn't just like robotically run up and down, like that's like the Stranger Things kind of melody, isn't it? Yeah, I didn't really just like robotically run up and down. You'll see there are certain points in the arpeggio where I go back and forth between a couple notes. That's how you want to phrase them. It's not like you don't have to keep going like from top to bottom each time. You're allowed to like stop at certain points and kind of go back and forth and rub between different notes. Just because you know the whole entire shape doesn't mean you have to run up and down it. You don't have to use all of it. You only need to use what you genuinely need, not what you feel like you have to play. So now that we've got some sort of idea of how we can use these arpeggio shapes around chords, we should also look at how we can use them around scale shapes as well, right? They can greatly influence the phrases we play inside of a scale and make us sound less noodly and less scalular and just playing up and down a scale. When we have an arpeggio that we can kind of run back and forth between, it makes our phrases a bit more interesting. It gives us more of a strong connection to the chord we're playing over the top of. So yeah, we often have a problem when we're playing scales, is that we sound like we're just running up and down a scale. It's quite predictable. Now, the arpeggios are going to spice things up a bit, right? So to fix the problem of just sounding like we're playing a scale, what I want you to do is next time you play a phrase, so let's say we're playing like A minor. We're playing that A minor pentatonic. I want you to look at where this arpeggio shape kind of fits inside that A minor pentatonic. So next time you play a phrase in your pentatonic, I want you to try and end it on a point of that arpeggio shape and then run up and down it and see what kind of phrases you can come up with. Like, you can see there, we're like, just by bouncing up and down different arpeggios, we get so much more interesting sounds. It sounds a lot more melodic rather than just running up and down the scale. So let's say that I'm improvising over a 2 to 5 chord progression in the key of G major. So that's the chords A minor and then the chord D7. I really like playing over this vamp. It's really nice to improvise over the top of. So I could play like a phrase with the scale. And then when I land over here on the root note of the D string for A, I could play an arpeggio like that. And come up with phrases like that. It sounds a lot more glued to the chord. And again, you can go up. You can go up the arpeggio, or you can go down. It's completely up to you which direction you choose to go in. And again, I can do the exact same thing with this D7 arpeggio over here. So when I'm playing a phrase over the 5 chord, whenever I hit a note that's inside that arpeggio shape, I know that I can actually either run up or down if I choose to. So with that in mind, let's see what happens when I try and improvise over a 2 to 5 chord progression in the key of G major, following the scale shape, and being aware that whenever I land on a note inside an arpeggio, I'm allowed to actually use it to go up or down. So yeah, let's see what happens when I try that over a 2 to 5 chord progression. We can also combine these arpeggio shapes with our major scale shapes as well to play phrases that add a bit of tension while also having a strong melodic direction. It allows us to add tension without being kind of like chaotic and playing weird random kind of chromatic notes. And the way we want to do this, we want to think about taking fragments of each arpeggio shape and moving them around in thirds across our major scales. And again, to do this, we can create some interesting melodic phrases with nice sounding directions to them rather than just kind of being chaotic and sounding really kind of awful on the instrument. So you're going to find that when it actually comes to using arpeggio shapes in your phrases, you rarely run through the entire thing from top to bottom on the fretboard. You only really need to take like fragments of them. You don't have to use the whole shape every single time. Unless you're doing some like shredding or sweep picking, you're really rarely going to use the entire shape. So I'm going to demonstrate this by playing over a G7 chord vamp. And I'm going to run up and down like the major scale shape over here. And I'm going to use fragments of arpeggio shapes. So I have the G7 dominant 7 arpeggio shape that I can use here. And I know that, okay, I also have the 4 chord, which is right behind it, which is going to be F major 7. And above the 5 chord is the 6 chord over here. And again, I can use the minor 7 arpeggio shape around that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to play it around over here for G7 around this kind of major scale shape. And I'm going to take fragments like that from arpeggios from different chords inside that diatonic key, right? And when we do this, we add a slight bit of tension over this sound. It's nice, it's quite melodic, right? Because we're playing in intervals of thirds and fifths and so on and so on. But we're not playing the thirds and the fifths of the G7, right? We're playing the thirds and the fifths of different chords that are inside the same key signature. So the notes are always going to work, but they're going to sound slightly different and add a slight bit of tension whilst also staying quite strong and melodic to the sound that we're playing over the top of, right? It's going to sound like it fits and it's glued together. So if I think about using fragments of arpeggios from different chords inside the same key signature over like this G7 chord vamp, I could maybe like riff around and come up with something that sounds something like this. So as you can see, you don't have to be so rigid and only play the corresponding arpeggio for the chord that you're playing over the top of. You're allowed to use arpeggios for different chords inside the same key signature to create more interesting melodic sounds. You want to borrow those chords from the same key signature and use those arpeggio shapes where you can to add in kind of slight bits of tension. It doesn't sound like really ugly, but it doesn't sound like it's completely smooth over the chord as well. It's quite nice sounding when we use different arpeggios from different chords rather than the same chord that we're playing over the top of. The thing is, we can make our arpeggios sound so much more sophisticated when we start to think about using modal harmony alongside our arpeggios. Now, this might sound kind of complicated, but luckily, I've made a video on the modes for you that makes them as simple as humanly possible to understand and actually use within your playing. So if that sounds interesting to you, you're going to want to check out this video that I made for you over here.